Hi, my name is Gittie Neufeld, and I am proud to be the moderator on this session on Is Home Always the Best Option? I would never, ever, ever, ever dream of telling people in this position to turn off their cell phones, because I know that everybody here is worried about somebody at home, but I will ask you to please silence them, or at least put them on vibrate in case, chas v'shalom, there's an emergency. So our session today is about, is home always the best option? What I'd like to do is tell you a little bit about myself and my experience and why I'm moderating this session, and then introduce our two presenters. Once the presenters do their brief presentation, each one of you should have 2 index cards. They're there for questions. If you need more index cards, feel free. And that's how we'll handle the questions. You'll pass them up and we'll be able to address them. If you have a particular person you want them addressed to, right, Dr. Carrey or Brian Rosenman. If not, we'll just throw it out and see whoever gets to the question first. Anyhow, so my name is Gittie Neufeld, and I say that I'm not a member of the sandwich generation, I'm a member of the panini generation. Because I feel, Baruch Hashem, squashed and squashed and squashed more every day. I have elderly parents, Holocaust survivor parents. My father is in the end stages of dementia. At one point, both these gentlemen can testify. Last week, we had a minion at my father's bedside. I didn't know if I would be here today. Baruch Hashem, I am here today. And it's really a challenge. I am the only girl in my graduating elementary school class of 200 girls that was a firstborn daughter that was not named after a grandparent, not named after a grandmother. I was fortunate that I had 3 grandparents. Growing up, my grandfather had passed away after the war, shortly before my parents got married. My other grandparents, my last grandmother passed away when my daughter was 15. So we really was zocheh to see generations, and that was, I think, had a great impact on the way my family chose to handle home issues. I was blessed with a wonderful mother-in-law who worked until she was 90 years old. She'd been widowed for close to 30 years, still went to work every day. Yekisha lady, need I say more? From Washington Heights. She then started forgetting things. She didn't really have dementia, but she had what's called TIAs, temporary ischemic attacks, and would forget. Her short-term memory was somewhat compromised. She also didn't hear that well, so she would go to the doctor herself, having made the appointment herself for after work. And then I would call her at night and say, Mom, what did the doctor say? She goes, oh, these young doctors, they all mumble. So I would have to call the doctor the next day and find out what they said. Or she would go, she had profound osteoporosis, she would walk bent over, not with a cane or anything, and could only carry 1 shopping bag of groceries home. So that meant that she was going to the grocery every day because she couldn't carry more than a container of milk. So I was going to Washington Heights every day. Monday was laundry, Tuesday was doctors, Wednesday was bakery, Thursday was butcher. And it got to the point where I still had children at home. It was disruptive. And I said, Mom, you have to come live with us. It's just easier. I'm afraid for you at night. We literally dragged her kicking and screaming. Hashem sent her a signal. She broke her hip. And she just didn't go home from the hospital. She came to us. That was it. In 6 weeks, we built an apartment for her, added it to our house with a handicapped accessible bathroom, an alarm system so that she could signal that she needed help. But we are fortunate we live on a corner, and so she even had her own address. My address is 1251 Sage Street. Her address was 875 Central Avenue. So if you didn't know her, you didn't know she was living with her children. She had her own door. There was a connecting door between the 2 apartments through our living rooms, but she was able to be independent, but I could get to her in a flash, and she joined us for supper, breakfast and lunch. She took care of herself. I did her shopping for her. I did her laundry. And that model was really, it worked, it was great. I will say that I think my children and my grandchildren benefited greatly from having Amma around and in a home setting. She did need help. She couldn't bathe herself. She couldn't dress herself. And guess what? I did it. And I'm a daughter-in-law. And there's a difference in the dynamic between a daughter and a daughter-in-law. And I have to admit that to everybody. That was the model that worked for her. She had a heart attack, passed away 2 weeks after her 91st birthday from her first ever heart attack. I felt like I was so neglectful because I was the daughter-in-law who took her to every single doctor. I had a list like this, And Hatzalah takes her in the ambulance to North Shore, and they say to me, what's the name of her cardiologist? And I said, she doesn't have one. And the guy is like, she's 90 years old, she doesn't have a cardiologist. She never had a heart problem. That was the only thing that really worked. So, but that's how it worked. On the other hand, I'm Baruch Hashem blessed with parents. My father was diagnosed 15 years ago with dementia. And initially, it was very, very slowly progressing. My mother, who is, I'm going to get very emotional. My mother is an extraordinary Ashes Chayil. My mother cared for him at home until exactly a year ago. We did have caregivers that we paid privately, and I would encourage all of you to go to any financial planning session you can, because that's why we ended up paying privately. Cared for him at home as he slowly lost his ability to speak, slowly lost his ability to move, slowly lost his ability to take care of himself. And it was a very frightening thing for the family. We took turns, we still do take turns going to my parents' house for Shabbos, and so that my mother would have a normal Shabbos no matter what else was going on. A year ago, my father was in sepsis and had pneumonia, and they had to do a tracheotomy on him so that he could breathe. They then had to put a feeding tube in, and at that point, my 80-year-old mother cannot care for my father at home. My father is now in a nursing home. He, unfortunately, right now is in ICU, but he's been in a nursing home ever since. And it's really a challenge. My parents' house is set up to care for my father at home. There's a stair lift, there's a hospital bed, there's a Hoyer lift. And it's interesting. My mother, like we said, Mom, why don't you put the regular bed back into your bedroom? She can't. She can't. And it's really, I have to say, this is probably one of the greatest challenges in the life of a child, but I think it's also one of the greatest blessings in the life of a child to be able to take care of a parent. And in some teeny tiny way, to give back to them. And it's hard. And when your father walks into your house and there's a mirror on the door, mirror on the closet door, my father walked in, I'll never forget this, and he stuck his hand out to give Shalom Aleichem to the man in the mirror with a beard. And I said, Tati, dus bist die, that's you. And he says, ich hab nicht kabord, I don't have a beard. And then he touched his face and he goes, oh yeah, he forgot he had a beard. And it's heartbreaking at the same time to see that parent being able to play, whether it was my father or my mother-in-law, play with children and grandchildren that were not going to go to a nursing home or an assisted living facility. But here, on the way home from yeshiva, they could just stop off and run in and say, hi, Oma, what's doing, is a blessing in, not even in disguise, it's a blessing manifest. We have unique challenges in this generation because of the healthcare system. We are able to, people's lives are prolonged, and it's a bracha. But that challenge carries with it the blessing that we do have the ability to show our children and grandchildren the respect, the care, and the affection that we can give to our parents in whatever setting is required. And that's really the goal of this session. When I was speaking to our presenters before we started last week, I was talking about the concept of a continuum of care. That it can range from just calling to check in once a day to having to make sure that the parents' needs are taken care of 24/7 on an individual basis. And there's a continuum. And that continuum changes constantly, needs to be reassessed constantly. And you and I might have we think exactly the same situation, but what's the right solution for you may not be the right solution for me. And it's important to bear that in mind. So with no further ado, I'm going to introduce our speakers, ask them to talk about the options that are available, the pros and cons, and the continuum, as I said, and then there'll be time for questions. I'm going to ask you to give me your questions in writing, and there should be questions and not social commentary. Okay, so our first presenter is Brian Rosenman, who is the representing Comprehensive Eldercare. Comprehensive Eldercare is a healthcare company formed by healthcare professionals for the purpose of encompassing and providing all the services needed to properly care for and cater to our elderly population. Their team of geriatric case managers determines the level of service that each client requires to live their life to the fullest and most comfortable lifestyle. In order to meet those needs, they also provide services such as Elder Check, Wellness Watch, in-home companions, medication management, etc. They also specialize in the operation of assisted living facilities in the Northeast under the leadership of their founder and CEO, Brian Rosenman. He is a recognized assisted living operator in the Northeast with a substantial concentration in the New York State market. So with no further ado, Brian, we can also call him Billo. Come on. Stand up. I think you better be standing.
Hi, my name is Brian Rosenman. So I'm an assisted living operator in the state of New York. Thank you, Mrs. Neufeld. I'm here today to discuss about assisted living. For those of you who do not know what assisted living is, I'm going to start by giving a brief explanation as to what assisted living is and who could benefit from it. When home is no longer a safe or beneficial option, assisted living may be what is best. In assisted living community, an individual has their own living quarters. Depending on the facility, you might have a private or semi-private room, a studio, or even one bedroom. At the same time, the individual is part of a community where their daily activities, such as meals, snacks, and 24-hour care is to help the individual with whatever they need. It gives the individual an opportunity to have all the assistance that they need, that they may be getting at home before, while living in an environment that provides them with a consistent stimulation, socialization, and supervision. Assisted living is really balancing independence with care. And why do I say that? Because when a person comes into an assisted living, it could be that they can do a lot of their activities of daily living on their own. They can dress themselves, they can shower themselves. But in an assisted living community, as you grow, and unfortunately a person declines, the help is there for them 24 hours a day. What is unique about assisted living is that you have tremendous amount of socialization, thereby accomplishing the goal of aging in place. People need to view assisted living as their loved one's home, somewhere where they socialize, have activities, can invite guests over, or even go out. In the assisted living community, there's no need to worry about laundry, housekeeping, because the staff will take care of all of that for you. Another major part of assisted living is medication management. The facility will make sure that the loved one has the proper medication that is given to them at the proper times as per doctor's orders. Doctors and professionals will come on site to the assisted living community, thereby assuring that your loved one is getting the medical that they need and not missing appointments to the doctor. If a visit to a specialist is needed or necessary, the facility will arrange that visit and an aide will take them to the appropriate doctor. Again, not missing a beat if something needs to be done for them. Additional services are brought into the assisted living community, such as lab work, x-rays are done in the assisted living community, physical therapy, occupational therapy, and even wound care will come right to the facility. Even hospice is an option if necessary, which greatly reduces the burden on the family. Missed doctor's appointments is a constant problem with elderly living at home alone, especially when families do not live nearby. Who's going to take mom to the doctor? And even if the appointment is made, who said mom's going to want to go to the doctor? Of course, children will always love to be there for their parents as much as possible, but there are 24 hours in a day, and people do have lives, and it gives the family the ability and peace of mind that their loved one is always being watched over and taken care of, even when they can't be there themselves. Although, of course, they are welcome to visit as often they would like. Mealtime. Mealtime is also a very important aspect of assisted living. Many elderly living home alone do not eat proper meals. Oftentimes, children come to visit and find old food in the refrigerator, or food that you might have sent them in the freezer untouched. In the assisted living, the residents are supervised by mealtimes to ensure that they're getting proper nutrition that they need. Furthermore, a licensed nutritionist is required to plan each meal with the proper nutritional guidelines. Finally, the facility is required by law to weigh each resident on a monthly basis to ensure that the weight remains at a healthy number. In an assisted living community, family does not lose control. They just become a part of a bigger team to care for their loved one, but obviously always have the ultimate say in decisions regarding their loved one's care. As a caregiver, how would you know that it might be time for your loved one to go to an assisted living? There are various signs, and some are very obvious. You may find bills that are unpaid. You may be finding your loved one isn't eating properly, or you might find that they're falling and trying to keep it hidden from you when you visit. You might find they're becoming forgetful. You might find he or she are not taking their medication when they should. They might be becoming isolated at home due to their inability to go out like they used to. You just notice that they're not thriving at home as well as you would like them to be. There are many services that an elderly person can get at home, no doubt. However, especially when children live out of town, assisted living is just a better option. The staff is in charge of their care and constantly being monitored. In an assisted living community, we are your advocates for your loved one. When an elderly person is stuck at home with limited social interaction and activities, their mind are not being stimulated. It can lead to depression and loneliness. They kind of turn off. A story comes to mind of a family whose loved one lives in one of my communities for a few years, lived in my community for a few years. As with every admission, a pre-admission interview is required, whether myself or an associate would go out to meet their prospective residents. I remember very clearly when I walked into this lady's house, we'll call her Sophia. She was sitting at the dining room table, fast asleep. She had a TV on the table, blaring, what I assume was a good soap opera, and a 24-hour care aide right next to her, also pretty much passed out. As I was speaking to her daughter who accompanied me to this visit, she told me that, Brian, it's great you have so many activities at the facility, but I want to tell you, Sophia will not do any of those. She just sits and sleeps and so on and so forth. Not surprising to me, she thrived in the community. She lived there 3 years. Not only did she participate in every activity in the community, she was a talk of the community, of the facility. Months later, I received a letter the daughter wrote thanking myself for the facility and wrote, quote, that we brought her mom back to life. Many times you see individuals at home who are sitting at home and they might have 24-hour aides. And their ADLs, their activities of daily living, their showering, their grooming, even help to the toilet is being catered to. But they're not interacting anymore. And how much can a person visit? People work, people have lives of their own, they're going to school. At the end of the day, assisted living might be an option for your loved ones. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's now my honor to introduce Dr. Zev Carrey. Dr. Carrey is an attending physician specializing in internal medicine, pulmonary medicine, and critical care medicine. And his father is in the back chefing us, so everybody tell him how proud we are. He is a member of AFSEL and a member of the AFSEL Rockaway's Five-Count Medical Board. He's a longtime Far Rockaway resident, and his current practice includes homebound patient care as well as assisted living and nursing home patients. Please give your attention to Dr. Carrey. And his Mechutz platform.
Thank you very much for that warm introduction. And thank you to Achiezer for sponsoring such a important conference. We all know that when you speak about the elderly patients and the elderly family members, but this really could be extended to family members and friends who not only are elderly but otherwise may have needs that require them being either homebound or institutionalized, and it's really what we can do to help them. I feel like a moderator a little bit because you try to present the side that home care is the best, and Brian is presenting a very strong case for assisted living, and hopefully I'm going to balance it in between, and I do take care of patients in all the settings that we're speaking about. We know that, especially when we talk about the elderly, and we'll sort of focus on that because it just makes it simpler.
It's Eldercare.
It's Eldercare. That the elderly create a certain economic situation that falls upon the caregivers and the family members. There are health issues that have to be addressed, and there are social interests that have to be taken care of. And the question is, how do we, as those caregivers and as society, handle that? But a more fundamental question is, how do we even recognize that there's an issue to begin with? How do we know that somebody actually needs the help? So it reminds me of a story. It'll be my only funny story for the night. There was a Mr. Smith was an elderly gentleman. He was driving home from work, and Mrs. Smith calls him up on his cell phone, and she says, "Oh dear, I'm so glad to hear your voice. I was very nervous. I was listening to the traffic report, and I heard that there was somebody driving the wrong direction on the highway." So Mr. Smith says, "1 second." He looks out the window. He says, "No, dear, everybody's driving the wrong way on the highway." So the story is cute, and it suggests that maybe Mr. Smith is seeing things in the wrong light, and maybe that was a sentinel event that triggered the family's awareness that something had to be taken care of. But I think the reason why we're here is because there's another way to look at the story, and that sometimes we are the ones marching in the right direction, and everybody else really is marching in the wrong direction. And I think conferences like that bring this back to light. And the question that we're really posing is home the appropriate place for patients to be? And I'm going to try to help answer that question. So the first place you really want to look, where we look traditionally to see what the answer to questions like this is, we look towards our holy books and our religious sources. In the last 2 weeks, we've been discussing Yaakov and his sons. And if you look closely at the psukim, we see that Yaakov and his sons seem to be sharing some primary residence. The sons would come home, they get sent out, he says, go bring home food, they go home and they bring home food. So it does imply that maybe they're all living together, and maybe that is the perfect environment according to the way the Chumash discusses it. I saw a fascinating medrash on this week's Parsha, Vayechi, and it said Yosef sends his sons to Yaakov for a bracha. And then it says, Yaakov says, oh, who's at the door? And he says, well, Yosef and his 2 sons. So the medrash says, why was it that Yaakov didn't know who was there? Weren't they living in the same place? And it says that Yosef did not frequently visit Yaakov. It doesn't say where, but it says it didn't frequently visit him because he was concerned that if his kids would go there and the grandchildren would be playing with the grandfather, he would ask them, how exactly did your father end up in Mitzrayim? And he was concerned that if he would tell them the answer, Yaakov would be very upset and curse his sons. And we know that the curse that Yaakov gave to Rachel, even inadvertently, came true. So they were very concerned that the curse he might give his sons intentionally would be even more powerful, and he could actually have destroyed the world. But we see that there may have been a disconnect between where they were living. It raises a separate question. Are you allowed not to tell exactly the truth to people, which is a separate issue? We do have lawyers in the audience, maybe they can answer that question. And the other question is, what did Yaakov think? I'm not sure what the answer is. What was Yaakov thinking? Like, how did Yosef end up at Mitzrayim? But we do see that living at home or living with your family is not necessarily something that is unique. So the question is, how do we handle it when we realize there is a time for someone to get the extra care? And how do we recognize that? And what do we do about it? So we know there are options. There is an option to keep patients at home and treat them. And it does take a lot of work and effort. And I'll discuss that a little bit more in detail. But there are other options like assisted living and even sort of more advanced options like nursing homes completely. So we know that our ultimate goal is to keep our patients healthy and safe. And nowadays, especially with insurance requirements, we try to keep them out of the hospital, we try to keep them out of the emergency room, we try to prevent them from having to have admissions over and over again back to the hospital because the insurance companies really don't like that. So I'm going to discuss some of the issues that come into play when we are evaluating and when we take care of these patients. I will probably raise more questions than I'm going to answer, but we also have to realize that the people we're taking care for are not just in a stagnant, plateaued position in their medical health. It's a dynamic process, and they have to be reevaluated as time goes on, and we have to take their situation and decide, do they need to have a change in their care, or are we able to continue the care we're giving them? I'm going to go through a number of things that we evaluate, and I'll comment on them as I go, and you'll see it's not always a simple process to just decide, yes, they should be in the home because that's the best place, or no, they can't be in the home. So the first topic is really, what are the diagnoses or the medical conditions that the patient has? So we know that sometimes someone can have a condition that's reversible. Someone may have pneumonia, they may be sick in bed, they may have high fevers, they can't move, but we know that after a few days they may get better. In an elderly patient, that may be true as well, but it also may be something that can become something more difficult and chronic. Or patients can have other reversible conditions. Or they may have a chronic condition that is going to be plateaued. They're going to have someone with advanced emphysema. We just know that they're limited how much they can get around, but all the other facilities they have may be stagnant, they may be the same over time. They may have a progressive condition. They may have a dementia, which we know will progress over time. And lo and behold, they may have a terminal disease that we know that they're going to deteriorate quickly. So we have to take that into consideration initially. We also have to know what kind of medications they require. Do they just have to take pills? Do they have to mix their pills? Do the pills have to be broken and crushed? Who is going to administer the pills? People think that if they hire an aide nowadays, that you could just have the aide administer the medicine. Well, it's not so simple. Somebody actually has to measure out the medicine. Someone has to set it aside. Nowadays, the law does not allow just any home aide to provide the medication. So whereas in the past, you might have told your aide, here's the medicine, it's in the boxes, please administer to the patient. Nowadays, that's not so simply true anymore. And in order to have someone provide a medication, they have to have special certification, which means they may not be approved by whichever agency it is that you're using. So that raises other issues. There's sometimes patients come home and they require intravenous medication. They may have a PICC line. Who's going to be able to administer that? Also, the medical care they're going to receive, and that's true whether or not it be in the home setting, maybe a little bit more challenging in the home setting, but even sometimes in assisted livings, is who is going to provide the care or make the evaluations. As much as we like to believe that there's going to be staff available 24/7, that's not always the case. And someone may need an evaluation from a nurse. They may need to be seen by a doctor, but the doctor may not be scheduled to come for another 24 hours. You need to know what availability does the patient have in order to get those evaluations done. The other thing that medical care entails is things like lab tests, x-rays, things like that. So it is now much easier than it was in the past to get some of these things done at home. There are companies that will come into the house and do x-rays. There are companies that will do blood tests. They will do almost any test we can imagine. They will come into the home. As long as it's a portable test, they can come in and out and do. And that gives us a lot of leeway. If someone has a cough and you're not sure if it's pneumonia, you don't have to send them to an emergency room or an urgent center. They could be home, and within a number of hours, you can get results of an x-ray and blood tests. Another condition that we have to pay attention to is the patient's ability for cognition. Some patients are wide awake and alert, and they are interactive, and it's very easy for them to communicate. But we know that there are different levels of cognition. Some patients are confused, some patients have full-blown dementia, and some patients are just not interactive and have no communication skills whatsoever, which is also associated with their moods. Patients could be depressed. It could be very much of an impairment to take care of them or to have others take care of them. They can have anxiety. They can have outbursts, and they can actually be combative. Those are not situations which are easy to take care of at a home with a home giver, with a caretaker, and they could be even challenging in an assisted living situation. But those are things that we have to take into account when we want to decide where should the patients be. Just something as simple as feeding a patient is an important question. Can they eat by themselves? Can they eat and be fed? Most assisted livings, I think, expect that the patient should be able to participate in some sort of communal dining room. What happens if a patient needs to be fed? Are there facilities or abilities, either in the home or in another setting, for them to be fed? We know that scientific evidence says that if you feed a patient, you're better off than giving them a feeding tube. But that sometimes could take hours per meal, and sometimes the whole day could be taken up in feeding them. That's not necessarily going to be a simple solution if you're either in an assisted facility or if you don't have the right caregivers in the home. If somebody does have a feeding tube, and they can have a feeding tube at home, is there somebody who's knowledgeable about how to deal with it, and how to deal with it if there's a complication? In the summers, I go to Camp Simcha, and at Camp Simcha, we have a large number of kids who have feeding tubes, and they're fed all night long. We train high school kids how to deal with those pumps, and they know how to troubleshoot. But that's not always such a simple thing if you don't have backup in order to take care of that. And that could be either in the home or in other facilities. What about communication? Can the patient express themselves well enough to tell somebody that there's a problem? Can they use that emergency button that you have on the wall, or can they not? If they can't, so it doesn't matter that they have it, they have to be able to use it. Or is there somebody close enough that will be able to respond if they do have an emergency? Does the hearing aid work if they have a hearing aid? Do they have special telephones? Do they have telephones that will automatically dial? What about transportation? How about getting a patient from point A to point B? Whether or not it be in the house, whether or not it be to get out of the house. Do they need walkers? Do they need wheelchairs? Do they need scooters? Are those things available? Nowadays they are, but they have to be made sure that they are done in a way that's safe for the patient. What about simple things like bathing? So in the home, we know bathing could be a big challenge. It's not always the simplest thing for a family member to take on those responsibilities of the toiletring and the bathing of an individual. So there are ways to get around it. They build these bathrooms that are like shower bathrooms, that you can have it all inclusive, that has built-in handles and built-in seats and built-in chairs, that someone could do that with a minimal assistance. But those things have to be taken into place. What about companionship? which is obviously a very big issue for any of our patients. And the answer for companionship is it depends. You have to know, is your loved one going to have people visiting? Are there family members? Are there neighbors? People who can come and see them? You don't want to put somebody into a situation where they're left alone and they are not cared for. I was just speaking to somebody about reminding me that during Sandy there was someone who lived alone in our neighborhood, and the neighbor took it upon themselves to make sure they got placed because there was no family in the neighborhood. What about when there's an emergency? Do you know who to call? Are there people to call? So Baruch Hashem, in our neighborhood we have a very active AFSEL. We have a lot of hospitals and we have ways of getting people. But if someone's in a much more suburban area where they don't have such such facilities, so keeping somebody at home may actually present a danger if an emergency occurs. Simple things like housekeeping and shopping. Is there someone available to help them with those activities? Obviously, safety is a very big issue. Do they have a bed that's safe for them? We know that patients will sometimes fall out of bed because they don't have the proper handrails. Or do they have somebody who is there to help them, to prevent them from wandering? I had a patient who was going home from the hospital, and then the social worker said they had to cancel it because the patient's bed was on the second floor, and the patient had a tendency to get up at night and wander. And if they wandered, then they wander down to the stairway, they may actually fall and create a problem, despite the fact that the aide was sleeping in the bed right next to them. What about things like exercise or rehabilitation? So can you have physical therapy and occupational therapy come to the house? The answer is yes. Go down to the booth. You'll see a number of the people who are advertising today do that. And we have a lot of patients who are getting physical therapy at home. We even have specialty. We have a hand specialist who go into the home and even design special devices for the patients if they need them. And then there's also the question of the end-of-life issues, which have to be discussed and have to be something that people can handle and people can be aware of. Patients at home we all eventually will face end-of-life issues, but sometimes we have to address them head-on. And if somebody is home, those things have to be addressed. And the question is, can they be handled in the way that the family wants? And can that could be communicated to all the people who are involved in the care? The other things that need to be addressed as well, which again are other issues here, which could be conferences in of themselves, and some of the other speakers will speak about this, are things like insurance. Do your insurance cover the things that you need either in the home or if the patient has to go somewhere else? Will the insurance pay for the devices that you need, whether or not it be beds, wheelchairs, Hoyle lifts, all the feeding tubes, all the things that you may need, will that be covered by the insurance or not? And if it's not, those expenses could add up very quickly. And of course, legal advice is always helpful, both for the short-term aspects of someone's care and for the long-term. And then again, the basic question is who's going to pay for the things that need to be paid for? So, taking care of somebody at a home is certainly possible. And I think most of us probably know of people who are cared for in the home until their dying day. And for many of them, it's a big schus and it's a big help for them, and it's something that's doable. For others, it could pose risks that are not appropriate, and sometimes it's not something that should be done. So, in the thinking about where a patient should end up, those are really a lot of the questions, and there are more than that you need to evaluate. Just for completeness sake, besides home care and assisted living care, we also know there's something called nursing homes. And the nursing homes are really designed for those patients who are no longer even eligible for an assisted living care, where they no longer could participate in those activities. They can't participate in the dining room. And sometimes those are necessary, and sometimes we can substitute the home care for those types of needs as well. So in closing with hopefully raising the consciousness a little bit, raising the questions, I would say that I would normally thank the organization that sponsored this, but really it's the audience here that really deserves the thanks, because as I started out with the story, that sometimes we have to think of ourselves as driving in the wrong direction, but as Gittie pointed out, it's really as a chus to our society that we've taken so much of this under our wings, and so many people have taken it upon themselves to try to keep their loved ones at home and to care for them with all the details and the nuances and all the help that it requires. That's really a zechus, and it's really a thanks to the people participating in the conference, and the fact you even have an idea or a wish or a goal, that should be the case. So thank you to all of you for making it real, and thank you for sponsoring.
Thank you. So we titled the session with a question, because it really is a question. And there is, as I said before, no one answer and no one solution, and it may not even be the same solution for the same patient at different times. But we'd like to open the floor to questions. If anybody has questions, please write them on the index cards. I'm very happy that Alan is here. My grandfather was his parents.
Could that be the best answer? We don't know.
So I feel very honored that he's here. I'll take the questions.
He spoke about end-of-life issues.
Right.
When you mean end-of-life issues, is that something you discuss with the patient, or?
Well, that's not really our goal in this session, but if you want to quickly
I'll
take
answer
it.
briefly because it could be a completely
Okay.
separate speech. End of life is a phrase that is.
What does it mean?
So end of life means discussing with family or patients, it depends on the setting, about what to do if somebody has a cardiac arrest. Do you want to have a DNR in place? Do you want to resuscitate them? Do you want to, or try to resuscitate? Do you want to provide artificial means of feeding the patient? Do you want them to go on a ventilator? Things like that are required.
Session 7 will deal with that.
And session 7,
Section 7? Okay.
Okay, if anyone else has any questions, I'm sort of like very quickly reading, and I didn't do Evelyn Woods, but I think there's one question which has, did I date myself by saying Evelyn Woods?
Who?
Speed reading.
who?
Speed reading. Okay, there's one generic thread, I think, that is addressed to both of you, and maybe we'll let both of you answer. And I'll read it in a variety of questions. Which is safer, home care, assisted living, or nursing home? Second part, balancing the best patient care with keeping the patient stimulated is certainly challenging. Can the presenters help draw the line between the physical safety that comes with staying home against the mental drop-off that comes with that safety? What are the limitations of assisted living in relation to a nursing facility? You mentioned 24-hour care. Is that allowed in nursing? And what about for assisted living for an older person who does not walk well and may have difficulty getting to the dining room, etc.? The difference between the nursing home and the assisted facility, and the difference between there were a lot of the same kind of questions. And then I have the other questions that I'm going to keep as a separate group, and I'll take yours as our gentleman answer. You can find out who wants to say it first.
No, I'll just say that that's a great question about assisted living. At what point is a person eligible? Does they belong in a nursing home or assisted living? I think as time evolves, the gap between nursing home and assisted living is slowly closing. So it used to be that if someone has to ambulate, with a walker, with a device, but has to, walk down the hallway, up the elevator, and is expected to come to meals, independently eat, and transfer no problem. New York State has issued new licensure called ALR, EALR, which is called an enhanced licensure. They've also issued called a SNAR licensure, we call it, which is a memory care, because dementia, unfortunately, has grown to a point where they recognize we need more places for residents that have dementia. And people are living longer, but they're not becoming sicker. They need more residential care, someone to watch them, someone to provide dressing, grooming, showering, someone to constant watch, medication management, pharmacy services. So to answer that question, the short form is saying that each facility can deal with someone differently, meaning a smaller place can deal with maybe a loved one who can't ambulate that well, but would do okay there because they're not expected to come down from 6 floors. I think that as time goes on, people will remain longer in assisted living. And nursing homes will become more rehabilitation centers, and for people that really require that nursing care that Dr. Carrey was talking about.
I'm going to exercise editorial privilege and just ask, aren't there facilities where some floors are assisted living and some floors are nursing home floors? So you really stay in the same building?
They're called CCRCs. They're continuing care retirement communities. They're not in New York. I mean, I don't know many of them in New York. They're prevalent outside of New York State, where they have independent, assisted, and nursing, which is wonderful because the aging place that I've spoke about really stays within the complex. I don't operate in CCRCs. I don't see much of it in New York.
Do you want to answer the safety?
I would speak about the safety of taking care of patients at home. And the question implied that if someone stays at home, inevitably there will be a deterioration because of lack of contact. So I think Gittie's introduction was actually very helpful because you can't generalize and say that somebody living at home and being taken care of for at home is detrimental to them. I think sometimes the associated question is it safer to be at home or safe to be in a facility? And the answer is, it depends. That's really always the question. There are certainly advantages to being at home if the setting is right. If you have the family members and you have the neighbors and you have all the facilities and people coming in, those patients often thrive, and often they'll thrive way beyond they would have done in the facility. Not to say a facility is bad, but we all know stories of people who have been admitted to facilities and then in a very short period of time, they were no longer with us. We also know that patients stay home and sometimes they don't get maybe as fast care, or they don't necessarily do well at home. But those patients that I know of that have been taken care of at home, with all the proper things and all the evaluations and all the considerations that were possible, and that everybody involved was on board to take care of them in the best way, they've actually flourished. We had, someone in our neighborhood recently was in her 90s. She was taken care of for at home. The family had very strict wishes not to have her go to a hospital because they felt at that age going to hospital would have detrimental side effects. And they said whatever happens, the quality she has at home is better than what she would have in the hospital. And she ended up dying in late 90s. She was in the hospital once in the last 5 years, and she had a constant flow of people in and out of her house, which I think everybody involved felt that really gave her life.
And she had no children.
No, I'm not.
No, okay.
So, I think those of us involved in taking care of people at home, I think really truly believe that it is a very good way to go. And if you can provide it, in many ways that's really an optimal. It's not for everybody. And it has to be done with all those safety factors, and all the issues have to be taken into careful consideration. But it's not automatic that if someone is home, they're going to have a worse outcome as a result. I think that's not necessarily the case.
Before we go to the second set of questions, I want to add to this. Anyone who knows me, and there are people in this room who know me well, I'm not a tzaddikas. I don't have a halo. It was hard caring for my mother-in-law at home. There's definitely a perceived lack of independence on the part of the children. I would walk into the house and my mother-in-law, being a Yeki, would say, "It's 10 after 4. Didn't you get out of work at 3? Did you stay late?" Or the mail, I would know what was in the mail before I opened the mail because she had already sorted it for me into whatever categories. Vacations were a thing of the past, extended vacations for sure. It's not, I have to say this, and I love my mother-in-law dearly, and I cared for her. I think those people who knew her, I can say I cared for her well, but it's not an easy thing, and there are days where it's really hard, and if you're doing it, you need somebody to talk to at times. Go see the Rachel Lowinger session on caring for the caregiver, but it's not all, I know it's a schus and all that, and it is, ladies and gentlemen, it's hard as well. And you need to go into it with your eyes open. The second question was sort of about resources and what's available. So one question was, does the patient qualify for the same amount of therapy at home that they would get at the nursing home? Is there a difference in the amount of therapy that insurance would cover?
Yeah,
Abigail, as a nursing home person, is saying.
I can't comment on nursing home, but assisted living, it's like living at home.
Okay.
I do want to comment on before what Dr. Carrey said. I do agree that if you have the right tools in place and there are family involvement and the loved ones at home, that's a wonderful, wonderful thing. But how often is that? And I'm not trying to be prejudiced only with assisted living. How often? What is the reality of that? And I've had a lot of people have come to me, not Jewish, no religious people, and said to me, I have my mom at home. I haven't left the house in X amount of months. I lost my job. So at the end of the day, is it really the right thing? So I 100% agree. That's wonderful. But there's definitely always two sides to the coin.
So actually, I'm going to skip let me take this question because it feeds into what Brian was saying. In your experience, Dr. Carrey, what are the main barriers to home care? And I think you identified one right here.
Opening the door.
So I think the main barriers to home care is really having these things in place. And you have to have caregivers who are going to be responsive to your needs, which again depends on how significant those needs are. Some patients need to be seen once a month, and some patients need to be seen more often. It comes to a point where sometimes patients need to be seen at home because they can't get out, and that creates a lot of barriers, especially if they need to go out for consultations, if they need to get things done. But I think the ability to have in place certainly caregivers, professional caregivers, visiting nurse service that is in tune, a physician, a nurse, you have to have those things in place in order to make it happen. And it also depends on the severity of the patient. Some patients require very little care. They just need someone to check on them once in a while. But we've had patients with feeding tubes and tracheostomy tubes, and we've been, you're able to do that. But again, it does take a lot of work. It takes a lot of effort, a lot of coordination of care and giving. And there is definitely a very strong role for the assisted livings nowadays. They are much better reputations than they had decades ago. And they really like mini hotels very often, and that's how they're treated. Patients go down to the dining room and they get dressed up before they come down. But they're not all on that level, and you have to decide for yourselves.
Right, I mean, you can't generalize. I mean, you can't say this patient belongs at home. It's impossible. You can't say this patient belongs to assisted living. Each person has their individual needs, and each person has their individual families. Obviously, a patient that requires minimal assistance, someone to help them in the home a little bit, and cognitively they're there, meaning they know what's going on, they remember who everybody is and when they ate dinner, if they could take a medication, they're probably better off in the home.
Okay, 2 more questions. One is, what is a resource for specialists like doctors and dentists who make home visits? Is there any way of accessing that information besides Dr. Karen?
Is
there information
That's a
available?
big challenge, not that I'm aware of.
I would imagine you could probably contact Achiezer, 516-791-4444, and ask them to help you out. They do have an
I
extensive...
would think the insurance companies wouldn't let doctors make house calls.
No, they do. They do. Of course they do. Of course they do.
I know of a company that does it. They send all different types of doctors.
Right, so there are companies available, and I think that if you call Achiezer, they can give you a referral. One is,
Individual doctors.
and you can just call the doctor and say, could you make a house call? Again, if they can even do x-rays at home, they can really do, I don't think MRIs can be done at home yet.
No.
Not yet, but the other thing that I want to say before we get to the last question is if you have any additional questions, you can email info@achiezer.org. With your question, we will send it to the appropriate person and get it back to you, get the response back to you. info@achiezer.org. If you have any questions, or you can call the Achiezer number. Don't make it an emergency call. Hit the regular number, not number 1 for emergency, and they will get back to you. So the final question is, what is the difference between a licensed and a non-licensed facility, and what should I be looking for? And I guess that's Brian.
In the state of New York, you're not allowed to provide personal care without a license, period. You're not allowed to shower somebody, dress somebody that in a facility that's unlicensed. So when you're shopping around facilities, I mean, we have the internet, look online for reviews, ask them for their licensure, plus they're required by law to provide their last survey, which tells you a little bit about what's going on in the facility. At the end of the day, you want a facility that's licensed because it kind of keeps everybody on their toes. And they're required to do the things I've discussed. Licensed nutritionists, weighing people every month. There's case managers that have to be on hand, following the case. Initial, psychosocial, family involvement. Licensure is difficult for the provider, but at the end of the day, it works for the consumer. So you should be wary about those items.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Okay. Yes.
In general, assisted livings are more expensive. There are some who take Medicaid, right?
Right. So New York State is I call it the slow state, because most other states they have what's called a Medicaid waiver program. Meaning, if I have Medicaid, I can go to an assisted living of my choice, and I can go to Brian's place because I like his salami he's serving, and I'm a Medicaid recipient. In New York State, what's called ALP program, which the government has been giving out beds slowly to each facility. As time goes on, I believe, it's my belief, because I was told there's another application coming out, the government's going to give out more beds to assisted living, that we can provide the services, that a Medicaid recipient doesn't have to end up in a nursing home. They could end up in assisted living.
Medicare or Medicaid?
Medicaid.
Okay.
Medicare will not pay for assisted living. That's for your medical costs, for Dr. Carrey. In terms of cost, there are a lot of facilities out there, and yes, and some are very fancy and charge a lot of money. But look around. I mean, there are facilities that are more affordable than others.
Any other questions or comments? I want to thank our presenters, and I really wanted to echo what Dr. Carrey said. I want to thank you, because I think there's a culture shift, and we really are swimming against the tide. We live in a time of disposable. We live in a time of warehousing. We live in a time of, if I don't see the problem, if I don't see the issue, it doesn't matter. And anybody that I know that's in our collective shoes is somebody who is not willing to say, I'm just going to shuffle it off to Buffalo and go on and lead my merry life. And I think that it's a credit to the culture that we are developing, a culture of caring and of really wanting to honor and do what's best for our parents. And I'll end with my mother's cliche. A mother can give birth to 10 children, but 10 children cannot raise one mother. And really, it's supposed to be able to at least try. Thank you. I hope you enjoy your next session. They should have replenished the food.